Welcome, everyone. I'm Angelo Robles to the Angelo Robles Podcast. I'm also the founder and CEO at Family Office Association. To give my audience a little bit of context of these amazing discussions, I'm so fortunate to do several times a week and learn from and impart guidance and information to both my members and selectively outside relationships. I help global families and their family offices solve problems, procure positive future outcomes, and prepare for intergenerational necessity. It's vital for families and their family offices to understand their vulnerabilities and become more resilient so they can mitigate risk and prevail during times of crisis. I'm really excited about today's dialogue. After doing these practically daily for going on about 8 months, not once have I covered this subject that I'm really intrigued by, and as are many of you. And that is investing in farms and farmland. Our special guest today is Jay Girotto, founder and CEO of Farm Opportunity. To give you a little bit of context, I was introduced to Jay by a very fine gentleman named Greg Cools, who I also need to reconnect with, probably a good 10 years ago. And once or twice, Jay came as a guest to some of my physical events at Family Office Association and spoke at one or two of them, and it probably goes back at least 6 years ago. So it's been too long. Jay, that was probably the days of the Greenwich Country Club. How are you?
Yes.
How are you doing today?
Yeah, I'm doing very well. We were at the Greenwich Country Club. Yes.
Yeah, you had to test my memory there, but those were some great days. I remember the day that I had Sam Zell and Ray Dalio speak on the same day was a hard day for me to forget. Unfortunately, it was too long ago, but it was a lot of fun. And yes, a little intimidating. I didn't get a chance to interview Ray. We had Greg Zuckerman of the New York Times. Well, hopefully I'm not messing that up. I probably am. He's a great Wall Street Journal. But I interviewed Sam, and that was a little intimidating. But I don't know if it's going to be as intimidating as interviewing you, because I don't know if I really know that much about farms and farmland. Now, my audience is going to laugh and say, Angelo, you don't know a lot about a lot of things. That doesn't stop you from asking questions. So I beat some of you to the punchline, by the way. And yes, that would be accurate. So many of you know lately I've been incredibly active with my members on wealth preservation, the moat around the castle, staying rich, protecting what you got, being more international, my interest in banks, insurers, and Bitcoin. There's another, in my research and talking to families, more and more mention, especially in that bucket that I just put it in, as well as investing, potentially tax and other buckets, including from a social perspective. Really, farms and farmland touches everyone. We all need to eat. We all want to enjoy it. And really, the number one areas of strain around the world often come down to people not having enough food to eat and not having proper education. So I'm not saying farmland's going to take care of the second one, but the issue of feeding the world is something that America generally has been pretty darn good at for a number of years. There's so much to discuss from many different angles. Jay, why don't we get right down to it? So I would assume that there is a difference between investing in farmland versus actually investing, owning an actual farm, meaning that includes the land, but also perhaps employees and the people, the farmers that work it, the equipment. There's nuances to the deduction and the engagement for either or. If you could give us a little bit of a foundation, that would be a great start.
Sure. Yeah, a background in farm investing. There are different ways to, basically invest in the farm or agricultural value chain, right? All the way from owning the land that's, producing the commodities or specialty products or things like that, to being a farm operator yourself, which you might do in conjunction with owning the land. Down the value chain into actual, agribusiness is that, process and create foods, whether that's, slicing apples or that's processing, things like hemp and stuff like that. So it's a broad spectrum of different places that you can actually go in and attack in terms of investing in farmland and the whole agribusiness value chain.
Well, I mean, I'm glad you taught me a new phrase. I'm going to use that one now, the agriculture value chain. Yeah. That's a good one. And you're correct. I mean, you gave basically a little synopsis from simply owning the land to literally being, quote unquote, a farmer, or owning the farm that has farmers and the equipment on it. Are there different nuances in profitability in the kind of land you're owning, whether it's farmed for, it has actual livestock, so they graze, or you're growing something specifically as produce, whatever, corn, wheat, broccoli, whatever it might be?
Yeah, so when you look at agricultural production in the U.S., setting aside livestock as a different topic, right? But you look at plant-based agriculture, there are really three categories of production. There are row crop production, which is about 60% of the value. These are things that you plant every year in rows. That's why it's called that. But this is basically corn, soybeans, and wheat are the largest ones. That it goes all the way down into things like edible beans and chickpeas and all the way down to cotton, right? And as I mentioned, about 60% of US ag production. The second category are specialty crops. These things are also planted on an annual basis, but don't really have a global market, right? These are things like, watermelons and squash and things, basically vegetables that are not, bush-based or vine-based in terms of their production. The third category is the last 20% are permanent crops. These are investments that are farmland that basically produces things like grapes for table grapes or for wine, stone fruit, which is any type of fruit that you can pick up in your hand and throw, like pears and apples, and then your whole assorted set of bushes, that produce things like berries and things like that. So those are the three main categories outside of livestock in terms of U.S. ag production. And you can think of it kind of a spectrum in terms of risk and return. On the row crop end of things, there's slightly lower returns, but there's certainly less risk associated with it because there are global markets for those products that are easy and transparent to price, as well as there is nearly very little, like maybe 4% or less CapEx that goes into an investment in a row crop farm. And then on the other end of the spectrum, where there's higher returns, but there's higher risk, you're in the permanent crop space. This is where, you take on two new types of risk. One is when you buy an orchard or you develop an orchard from raw land or, any type of permanent crop property. There's a significant CapEx expense in those trees and vines, as well as time that it takes for them to actually produce marketable produce, right, at scale. And so you can have anywhere from, depending on the type of crop and where you are in that CapEx cycle, you can have anywhere between 30 and 50% of the investment can be in that CapEx. And so if something happens to your trees, that's a very bad thing from an investment standpoint. The other risk that you expose yourself to on the permanent crop side is just consumer taste risk, right? So, if Golden Delicious apples go out of style, right? You can't just switch to Fuji apples, in your orchard without, tearing all the trees out and starting over. So that's kind of the broadest view, Angelo, of what's out there.
Yeah, that's very helpful and actually falls into line of what simply is logical. Some of the, like you said, the row crops, corn, soybeans, and wheat have pretty much a global market. They store relatively well. They, quote unquote, travel well via the supply line. They may not be as profitable for pound, but they're effectively a safer bet. My instincts would be that's going to be more large, more commercial production. When you're talking more about things like broccoli and watermelon and some of the other things you noted, it's going to be not quite as transportable. Again, certain things go in and out of favor. It doesn't have quite as much of a wide use, but it could be, quote unquote, a little bit more profitable. I'm going to ask you a lot of questions, Jay. And again, coming from an area that I really don't know much, but has the trend towards vegan and vegetarianism, if that's a proper word, has it actually made enough of a dent and an impact? Maybe more so when we get to talk more about organics. But do you notice that more regionally, if not nationally?
Yeah. So our strategy in terms of investing, for other families over the last 10 years and for our family over 3 generations has not been to be following, the trend, whether it's vegan or Beyond Meat or organic or what have you. It's instead to actually own the highest quality land in the world, take care of it really well, and make sure that you have water rights associated with it. Okay. So it has really been around owning land and water. And if you have those 2 things, you can go grow, organic corn if that's what the market wants. You can do GMO corn. You can grow plants that go into developing plant-based meat rather than growing plants that are fed to, feeding animals and livestock for real meat from pigs and cattle. So that's really been our entire approach to investing in farmland overall, Angelo.
So in terms of a quality of the land, the soil, the farmland, but you made an extra emphasis on water rights. Why? Explain that to our audience.
Yeah, so 96% of the farms that we own ourselves and for our clients actually are non-irrigated farms. So the water falls from the sky, and we've selected the regions that we're in as to be sort of the most resilient as it relates to climate change over the next century. And so we feel that this minimizes our risk profile versus having irrigated farmland where, you're always, pretty, in most cases, I would say, let's just say in the vast majority of cases, you are on irrigated farmland, you have some issues with dealing with the government and how that might change over time that you can't control.
Very good point. You mentioned climate change and the impact perhaps on waterfall and other factors. Very intriguing how that relates to farmland. I'm assuming, again, that's something that you got to be scientific in your approach as well. That must be very intriguing. You mentioned there are some areas, and we're being more US specific since your experiences, if you don't mind sharing, relative to relying on water falling from the sky, rain, where are some pockets? I don't know. Is it Minnesota, Iowa, Michigan? What are some pockets that you found valuable as an investor?
Yeah, so we are invested in 3 primary regions. One is what we call sort of the core of the core, which is Iowa and the edges of all the states that touch Iowa. So this is like, east of the 100th parallel in South Dakota and Nebraska, over into Illinois, into Southwest Wisconsin, southern Minnesota. So that area has a number of characteristics. Directly to your question, Angela, we feel it's far enough north that, if there are significant rises in temperature over the next 50 to 70 years, agricultural production there will not be as adversely affected as it would be, say, in the Mississippi Delta region or down, in the Southeast. The second region that we buy in actually is in northern Minnesota, directly on the border with Canada. So if you can think of from Fargo, up to Grand Forks, North Dakota, and then east into Minnesota, kind of the east half of the Red River Valley, but not very much in the Red River Valley proper. And up there, that is a strategy, a long-term strategy around climate change. Those are areas that traditionally have only grown small grains, things like barley, maybe soybeans, wheat. Now you're seeing better hybrids that have shorter growing periods for corn and soybeans, and you're seeing corn and soybean rotations actually being used up there, which is a great increase in gross revenue for the farm versus doing small grains. And then the third area that we invest in is actually out in the Pacific Northwest. Most of that land sits, if you drew a triangle from Spokane, Washington down to Pendleton, Oregon, sort of back through Walla Walla, Washington, over into Lewiston, Idaho. There's a certain region within that broader geography that's called the Palouse, if you ever look it up. And it's really the highest producing wheat ground in the world. And it produces primarily something called soft white wheat, which is not traded on the Chicago board widely. It's traded in Portland. And that's 90% plus of that's exported to Asia and the Middle East. And China is not, I think they're the number 3 or the number 4 buyer. So it's not like Philippines is the number 1. So it's a pretty broad-based export market for that.
I mean, let's take a little bit of the step back and greater understand that. We've had many discussions about the benefits of the U.S. and some of the challenges that the U.S. is facing. And many know that I've been an advocate of looking globally if you're a family of wealth from a variety of different perspectives. We had a pretty significant discussion about that with a very intelligent investor yesterday from Singapore. But I think that would help make the argument for America looking more beneficial decades out. And I want to try to find that touch me. And there's multiple areas that I think would qualify. Would you say, relative to your knowledge globally of farming, that there are, relative to our country, the soil, just how it played out to where the US is based? You mentioned that's the highest producing region in the world of, probably the most used crop. Well, it's technically soybeans, but probably by human consumption, it's probably wheat. Would you say there are pockets of the US, I think you just noted them, that are as strong as any in the world for the production of what we're producing from agriculture? And hopefully that will stay the way for a long time to come.
Yeah. I mean, in the areas particularly, where you can get mechanization of the agricultural process, right? You can really utilize the advantages in terms of soil, water, overall weather, to be the low-cost producer in the world for these commodities. That's certainly the case when you look at the production of corn, soybeans, and wheat at scale. The other, some of the other specialty and permanent crops, I'm not going to claim to be an expert in terms of our cost position in those areas, but certainly we appear to be very cost competitive when you look at, the production that comes out of California, for example, into the world markets.
For sure. Speaking of some of those specialty markets, someone sent me a text. It was actually on my mind to ask it later, but I'll just jump into it. You indirectly hinted at it with specialty. You also have to tip your hat to some marketing initiatives of those in the community in farming, meaning who would have thought, 20 years ago, that a big red fruit with little seeds that are hard to eat inside it, that pomegranates would become so popular. So I do give credit to the family that's LA based, that's behind it, and mainly POM. They're a great family. They have a family office, by the way, very impressive in terms of what they're doing. And it certainly appears to have wonderful health benefits. But I find that intriguing that they took a fruit that probably 5% of the population knew about 20 to 25 years ago. And now probably 75% plus of the population, if not more, is familiar with it. And it's relatively very regional to, I think, mainly that part of California. If you could talk a little bit from a specialty perspective.
Yeah, so certainly in investing in specialty crops and in permanent crops, which is largely the example that you gave, Angelo, it's one of the huge production areas in California, right? And also you get production in Florida and such like that. Those types of businesses, you definitely have to be much more of an active investor, right? Or have a manager that's actively, farming your farm. And you see that, throughout kind of the investors that are out there in this space. A good example to look at is what TIAA-CREF did. They're the largest agricultural investor in the world. They're in all the topics that we discussed earlier in terms of the markets. They're one of the largest owner of permanent and specialty crop farmland in California.
Wow.
And what they did, for years, they had a company called the Westchester Group that basically managed everything for them out there. And ultimately, about almost 10 years ago, they purchased the management component of that organization, not the real estate side of it, but the management component of it, to basically directly manage the agricultural production of their specialty and permanent crops that are out there. And I think that's something that you have to have in mind if you want to create something like a pomegranate farm or, whatever, an almond orchard or pistachio orchard or something like that, is that In those cases, because of a number of factors, you're more likely going to end up in a situation where your lease looks like an active or participatory lease in the production as well as the land ownership than what you would see more traditionally in row crop, where there's 50% of the in the round number 50% of the the farms in the row crop space are owned by somebody that doesn't farm them, right? They lease them out on a cash or a fixed basis.
Yeah, no, I mean, very intriguing. When I brought up pomegranates and you brought up some others, from olives to avocados to almonds, those are very, very specialty. They've arisen in popularity because of partially due to their health benefits and more interest in a healthy lifestyle. But I'm assuming with greater potential and more hands-on involvement is obviously greater risk. I'm intrigued by the sophistication of farmers in terms of whether it's the row crops you noted or perhaps some of the more niches that I noted, that they do need to hedge their risk, that things could go wrong. So part of it could be crop insurance, if you wanted to give a little bit of coverage on that. But I'm really intrigued by the potential to understand the commodities market and to hedge their risk. If you could talk a little bit about that, please.
Sure. Certainly our exposure is much more on the row crop commodities space, but there, what we do see is, there are forward contracts in for most of those products that you see in the commodities that come out of the row crop space that allow you to hedge, fairly liquidly, let's say 18 months out, maybe 24 months out. And so more than half of our leases are actually indexed to those commodity prices. And what we do there is, we typically have a floor, a realistic floor for a commodity. You can pick one, something, let's just use corn. Even through all the trials and tribulations of the last decade and, the Great Recession and Corona world and the Chinese trade war and all that, corn hasn't really averaged in a marketing year under $3.50. It's, touched 3.20, in certain areas. But anyway, you can basically go out and using, calls, hedge your downside, puts and calls, hedge your downside risk, as well as still get some of the upside exposure in case, there's a reason why that commodity price would go run up higher. My general knowledge around, in the specialty crop space and things like permanent crops is using those methods to actually hedge your risk is harder because there's not a liquid or a global market for pistachios or whatever you want to pick.
No, it certainly is. From what little I know, it's much harder. And that's part of the challenge about being more active in that type of produce, which may have its advantages, but it's not without its additional risk. Let's talk a little bit about kind of the advances with technology enhancements. Technology gets improved in agriculture as well. What type of technology innovation, whether it's impactful to soil, water, or the actual literal aspect of technology, maybe AI, I don't know. How has all that changed in the last couple of years to be more effective and efficient in farming?
Yeah, so it's definitely a very long-term trend in farming. So once we came out of World War II and we stepped into the Green Revolution, where you first saw, hybrid seeds and such, and Borlaug and, the World Food Prize and all that sort of stuff, you look at, U.S. ag production, and it's grown at basically right around 3% a year in terms of just growing more stuff, right? So you look at, like the average, for, bushels per acre in corn in 1980 versus today, it basically has, has doubled over the last 40 years. And that trend has happened from a number of different advancements, technological advancements. It's not just, GMO seeds or something like that. The invention actually of plastic drainage tile in the 1970s, which helps manage water on a farm. You bury it like 3 feet below the surface, right? That all used to be clay. But, the invention of that plastic drainage tile and installation of that, in any farm generally lifts the production by about 20%. And, wow. There's a long ways to go to install that. And that was something that started in the 1970s, right? So, fast forward more towards today, we're 20 years past, the broad introduction of GMO products. We've seen other areas of innovation over the last few years. In the last 10 years, a lot of that has been, GPS technology, as well as the introduction of drones and such, right? In terms of driving technological change and increase in productivity. One of the things people don't necessarily recognize with innovation and technology in agriculture is that not only do you have to have, the technological innovation out there, but you actually have to be able to operationalize it. Okay, and operationalizing it is not a small task, right? So, we're just on the tip of the iceberg in doing that in terms of drone-based technology, right? The ability to go and, take heat maps of plants that are growing and then feed that information to machines on the ground that can timely, make decisions on adding, fertilizer here, but not there, controlling a pest problem, in a specific area, that sort of thing. We're just getting started on that. It's an area called precision agriculture that is in the process of being adopted, and it's something that will take decades. And I think it will continue to see this long-term trend for increasing agricultural production from many of these factors.
And I'm assuming in the last couple of decades that learning crop rotation, different nutrients the soil may needs, water, that's all probably a combination of art and science. But I think back to like the Dust Bowl era and where things went really haywire, it seems like we're much more scientific in our approach now, which is a great thing.
Yeah, we're definitely much more resilient in our agricultural production because of a lot of those techniques that are being used, whether it's, we do very little tillage on our farms at this point. We use crop rotations that are no-till rotated. The introduction of cover crops over the winter, cereal rye to increase nutrients as well as prevent erosion. A lot of these things are starting to go down the road of being implemented much more widely than they were 20 years ago. We have the carbon credit market that's nascent, and you've got a couple of companies there. They're doing that. We had a bunch of farms that participated in that in the first time this last year. So, I don't know what the next set of innovations are going to be, but I think that that long-term trend shows no signs of stopping in U.S. agriculture.
And I'm thinking of, even in New York and Brooklyn and in LA, you're seeing more activity in inner city environments, obviously not for mass production, more for, farm to table, very locally in the community, but even in cities. And I'm assuming that aquaponics, the use of water, fish poop, and all that may not be great from a commercial business enterprise, but maybe it is, but has also changed some of the community dynamic of farming. And I'm assuming that's a good thing. I know very little about it, but if you wanted to comment a little bit, I'd love to hear your opinion.
Yeah, no, the introduction of vertical farming and farming in a container and things like that, I think is a very interesting trend for the types of mainly fruits and vegetables that can be grown that way, right? And I think that'll be interesting to see how that develops and how it impacts the production of things like tomatoes and strawberries and things like that. And those are kind of fall into that specialty permanent crop space. On the row crop side of things, I think it has less of a chance to have a broad-based impact when you just start talking about the sheer scale of a corn plant, a soybean plant, the number of seeds of wheat that you plant in a given acre, make it much more difficult to figure out how you're going to stuff that inside a vertical farming operation.
I see we had a wise guy just ask a question on text. Angelo, you're talking about vegans and the increase in plant-based foods and vegetables. How about all the people on paleo diets and meat only? That is true. I follow health circles pretty closely. I experiment with almost everything. And that is another trend that you're starting to see, probably less impactful, Mr. Who Asked That, relative to our discussion today. Although I did hint at it earlier, that there certainly is farmland that is more based on either maybe soy for animals to eat or literally for grazing for animals. I don't know if that's something you really wanted to comment on, or how does that compare profitability wise, a livestock centric farm?
Yeah, sure. So on the livestock space, we don't, that's another area that's an interesting area of agriculture. We don't do any direct work in the livestock space. Has a unique feature in that livestock need to be taken care of 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, whether it's Christmas or New Year's or anything like that. The dairy cows don't know that it's Christmas Eve. So that the way that we actually interact on the livestock side is that there's obviously a lot of livestock production around where we own farmland in the states that I discussed, and we typically set up relationships, whether it's a formal recorded manure easement or it's a license that's done on an annual basis, where we get access to basically animal manure waste, whether it's cattle, hog, or chickens. Turkeys as well, and then use that as what is organic fertilizer to replace commercial fertilizer. We have about a third of our farms get that every year.
Interesting. I didn't even think of that perspective relative to the poop, but yes, I guess that also makes sense. Very interesting. A little bit of an uncomfortable topic. You indirectly brought it up a little while ago, and I feel I have to, being someone who's pretty active in the health aspect of the community. Genetically modified or GMO. Yeah. Obviously, the large companies and farms, it creates a crop that's more resistant to pest. It probably stores better. It's more of for probably row type crops that you mentioned that may need to be expanded globally and need longer storage and ship times. But there's going to be an element of the community that makes a pretty good argument that that's changing something that nature produced, and it may not have quite the same health benefits in our body. I don't want to put you in the middle of that argument, but from your perspective, from investing in farm and farmland, how does that interplay?
Yeah, from our direct investing that we do, we're set up entirely as separately managed accounts, right? So if an individual investor or family had a strong feeling related to that topic, anything that you would buy or own or do could be, GMO or non-GMO or organic or whatever it is that you want to do. But from a broader perspective, Angelo, I would just say, I'll send you a link. There's a great program that NPR did about 7 or 8 years ago, where they had a pro-GMO person and an anti-GMO person, and they had an audience that was divided into thirds of people that were for GMO, people that were against GMO, and people that were in the middle, right?
Yeah, that's pretty cool.
I don't know if you looked at. Anyway, that's the best thing I think is worth is watching that and seeing both sides presented and seeing what happened. And sort of the punchline of that was that at the end of it, most of the people that were undecided were for GMOs after that discussion. But the people on either side, right, that are that came
got
in
more extreme
position, right, were more entrenched, right? Exactly. And so, my general take on it is, if you're entrenched on one side, there's nothing that I'm going to say or talk about that would change your opinion one way or the other. So, yeah.
And I'm going to be throwback to the 1980s here. And I know it's happened since then, but I think of something like Farm Aid. I think of Willie Nelson, Bob Dylan, and a throwback to the 80s to show my age, John Mellencamp. Yeah. All three of them I love, by the way, and many others. But there was a perception that the American farmer, not the big corporate entity, the American farmer was really under siege. It needed help from the government and from people in a good way. I don't mean that from a negative perspective. And the perception now is that the row crops have become very corporate. I don't hear as much about things like Farm Aid and the local farmer anymore. How has that evolved in the last couple of decades?
Yeah, I mean, there definitely has been a trend toward consolidation at the farm operations level in terms of row crop farming. But it hasn't been a consolidation to corporations running those farms. It has been more of a consolidation into larger family farm operations that we are seeing, because there are various restrictions on land ownership in the United States, and those restrictions pretty much prevent something like a Cargill or something like that totally vertically integrating down to literally owning the land, that goes into their co-ops and things like that that they then use to process for food. So I would say that the trend exists. It has been a trend toward larger family farm operations. I'd say that trend is stronger south of the Mason-Dixon line than it is north of the Mason-Dixon line. So there's some elements of the history of the United States that actually have had profound effects on agriculture in different places in the US. So clearly, the biggest one was the Homestead Act, right, which was implemented basically north of the Mason-Dixon line and distributed land, out that direction all the way to, Spokane, Washington. And that was where everybody got 160 acres, right, to leave and go make a go of it out there for free. And what that did was it created, as you might imagine, a very vibrant entrepreneurial frontier sort of mentality that went and, basically started agricultural production under the Homestead Act. And 5 generations later, you still see that in differences between how sophisticated and competitive operators are, say, in a place like Iowa or Illinois, versus, in a place like, Alabama or Mississippi, where, people that, own the land and never farmed it ever, right? In terms of the history of the land, right? So anyway, I will get off the history lesson, Angelo. So I'll let you go to the next question.
No, that was great and very, very helpful, which probably does segue pretty well into my next series of questions, which is going to be on kind of the business, the investing, and kind of the tax side as well. So I guess there's a couple of ways that someone could go about this. More commonly is to possibly be more passive, investing in the land, whether through a fund, a separately managed account, a direct investment specifically into the land, and having for lack of a better word, a professional farmer kind of do their thing, but you're not involved in that aspect at all, comparative to literally, quote unquote, owning and running a farm, which is much, much more, I'm assuming, hands-on and labor intensive.
Yeah, exactly. And in the land space, I think you juxtapose the two things that you have. And so in the passive investment space, there are, a number, well, there are 2 folks that do it. It's separately managed account. We're one of them at scale. And then there's a number of funds of different stripes that are out there that you can do. Our view is that, the return profile on the passive side is in the high single digit real returns, right? When you look out over 20, 30, 40 years. Okay. And that's can roughly equally be divided between cash on cash yield and land value appreciation. It's a little bit skewed given what's happened over the last 20 years to real yields towards more on the land value appreciation side, but you can roughly think of it historically as 50-50. The other approach in terms of the land ownership is to, either be the farmer yourself, or essentially hire the farmer and hire somebody to manage the farmer, where you actually own all the equipment as well as the entire output of the farm, market the output of the farm, all elements of those sort of things. There's a flavor on that where you own the land and there's something called a custom lease. And this is where you basically just do contract labor, where you don't own the equipment, but you contract, for the labor and the guy that owns the tractor to actually come out and farm your farm. And then there's usually a split between, whether it's you get 25% of the production and they get 75, or there's all kinds of splits that you can create.
Let's dive a little into that. Because you do not own the equipment the company you're contracting to does, there's going to, I'm assuming, be more limited depreciation and tax benefits.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, that really gets you more of a direct exposure to the production risk, as well as direct exposure to how you market the commodity. Our view for our investing, what we've done is that we think that indexing a flex lease, cash-based flex lease to commodity prices that have, that the base is based on the average production of that farm, it gets you a lot of the exposure of doing the custom lease setup without taking the production risk that's associated with that. So
if you're going to be a more passive investor in the land, are there any tax advantages relative to soil depreciation or anything?
Yeah, there are 2 primary, depreciation things that you can take. One of them is soil fertility. So when you buy the farm, you do a soil test, and there's going to be P and K, potassium and phosphorus and potash that are actually in the soil when you buy it. The IRS actually lets you deduct that. So we have a firm that has an agronomy, economist, and he basically takes all our soil tests and comes up with a depreciation letter that is written off. That allows you to shield the passive income for around 4 years, right? But then that runs out because you're not the person putting, the additional nutrients in the ground anymore. The second one is around tile and drainage tile, right? Essentially, what's a broad category of land improvements, tile, waterways, that sort of thing. That is typically depreciated over 20 years. It's similar for grain bin, if you put a grain bin up, or irrigation equipment if it happens to be irrigated. What percent of your investment is that? In a typical Midwestern row crop farm, that might be 1/7, or 1/8, around 12%, of your investment if you go out and you're able to depreciate that. So eventually, as you get out a number of years, and when you should only own farmland if you think you're going to own it for a long period of time, those depreciation and tax benefits eventually go away. And then, what your main benefit is thinking about it from a charitable giving or from a multi-generational standpoint, and, taking advantage of stepping up the basis. And while farmland doesn't have a lot of the same, benefits of other types of real estate in terms of, great depreciation advantages that you get in things like industrial or commercial or multifamily or retail real estate. The other interesting feature of it is that if it's well managed, you actually never need to put more money into it, right? If you're managing it right? And so you never have to feed it. You never have to redo your industrial building for the new client. You never have to redo the interior of your apartment building to make it marketable to, the next generation of kids, right? That sort of stuff. And so thinking about it from that standpoint and dealing on a multi-generational basis, there are some interesting things to think about there.
And for a family that wants to go more all out, and even if they're not hands-on being the farmer, but they want to own the farm, have a manager, they want to own equipment, that's going to be more interactive, potentially, and very debatably more profitable, very debatably also more risk. But you're really involved in the process. And for some families, and perhaps educating the next generation about just going back hundreds of years, the value of agriculture, of feeding people, not only your family, your community, but those that are more challenged around the world, it does kind of have an impact investing play, an education play, a rolling up your sleeves and understanding how things work, including, I don't mean to get a little sad on people, but on the livestock aspect, the reality is that they're, animals, not pets to the people, and they will, quote unquote, be put under for food. So there's both, there's a unique aspect to all of that I think is hard to duplicate, no matter how much money you have and anything else. That I'm going off on a tangent, I get it, but I find that a little bit romantic. I don't know what the word is, intriguing, which is why I've been an advocate for families to be more active in looking at the opportunity in farmland. But my real point was there could be some additional tax benefits from equipment, from buildings that may be on the property that, again, a very good tax person, more experienced in farmland and real estate, may be able to make that look like an even more attractive investment.
Yeah, that's definitely true. I mean, agriculture is sort of the last bastion of cash-based accounting, right? So, I mean, we have operators that have, farmer operators that have millions of dollars of cash flow that come in and they, reports, $50,000 of income, right? Because they're able to move those expenses and the depreciation of equipment and things like that, forward and back across the, finish line on December 31st to make themselves look, vastly less profitable than they are.
Which does bring up a little bit of a next question, and maybe this arose from what I mentioned earlier in the 80s with Farm Aid. And that is, from what little I know, there is a perception, and again, I don't mean it in a negative way, it could be good because farms are at the root and the heart of America and feeding people, that there is some, besides the depreciation benefits as noted, are there other, and maybe this is for more commercial enterprises, government subsidies and other areas that the American farmer, or really a farmer, I don't know, in other countries with their country, but let's talk about from a tax perspective and from a subsidiary here in America. Are there a little bit of under the radar and maybe want to be kept that way benefits on government subsidies to produce certain crops?
Sure. Yeah, so the biggest government subsidy that still exists, and let's set aside the last sort of 3 years of crazy, direct payment sort of stuff that was going on in the Chinese trade war, is the subsidization of crop insurance, right? So in the U.S., crop insurance is sold by your friendly neighborhood insurance agent, but the product is guaranteed by the federal government, and the price is subsidized by the federal government. And that, if you you're deliberate about what crop insurance that you buy as a farmer or as an investor that is actually actively farming, and then you're buying your own crop insurance, you're able to insure at a very cost-effective manner, anywhere between 75 and 85% of your revenue. So at a discount, obviously, right? So if you do have, a problem like a, tornado goes across your cornfield or something like that, or the, derecho that we had in central Iowa here back in August, you are able to, collect on those insurance policies in a way that it, it means that you're not going to take, a bit of a hit, potentially a bit of a hit. Depends on how the actual insurance pays out. You can actually sometimes make more money than you would, depending on what you can pick up, what remains if you're completely zeroed out. But it does allow you to have a reasonably stable revenue line that is insured.
I think you mentioned something a couple of minutes ago that I might have glossed over too quickly. You mentioned passing on generation to generation. So there is a tax advantage. Is it a step up in basis upon death for an asset like land applicable? If you could talk a little bit more about that. Yeah, and definitely. And one other tax thing we didn't talk about, Angelo, either is 1031 exchanges working. Yeah, that's a big one,
right? Just like any other real estate. So that's something you can think about too. If you and we've seen people sell an apartment building and do a 1031 exchange into farmland and that such. So, but yeah, the stepped up in basis in death or in transfer, does allow you to, in combination with the fact that you don't. If it's well managed, as I mentioned, you don't have to be thinking about when's the next cycle that I have to put a bunch of money into this thing, right? Those two things in combination make it a very interesting, long-term wealth preservation, right, vehicle, with the tax advantage of being able to, at some point, zero out your appreciation number as it transfers at some stage.
Yes, I think the step up in basis upon death, and again, I know we're talking United States for our international audience, kind of estate planning rules here in real estate. Because real estate and farmland is very valuable to a country, although what we're talking about is US specific, much of this in its own incarnation, from what little I know, but I know a little bit, applies to many other countries around the world as well. They want their to be people that are active owners of land that produce produce that helps to feed their people. So there are often tax benefits. You did bring up one that was next on my list, but I'm going to make the assumption, even in my audience, there may not be people who understand, hey, yeah, I heard a little bit about it on President Trump's tax return, but besides depreciation, taking losses, what is a 1031 exchange?
Yeah. And so that's basically a tax-free exchange from a like-kind real estate asset that you sell into a like-kind real estate asset that you buy, right? And you don't pay any taxes on whatever the appreciation was from your cost basis in the first property that you sold. And there are a number of other rules around it. The main thing is that you, from closing or selling, property A, you have 45 days at the end of that closing to identify your replacement properties, right? And then you have 180 days from the closing of property A to actually close on the replacement properties in order to get that tax benefit. So you do have to, be somewhat certain that you can line something up, right, when you sell, or you might face a tax bill. That's one of the favorite buyers that land auctioneers like to have in their audience, is the guy that no one knows but kind of looks familiar. and his 1031 tax exchange fell through, and he's got 2 weeks, to avoid a huge tax bill, and he's ready to buy anything he can find, right? So you do have to be careful about that. But that's something that we've done for 3 of our clients now, where the neighbor came and offered a ridiculous amount of money privately, for a farm that one of our clients owned, or a part of the farm, where we sold that and did a 1031 exchange into another farm because our client didn't want to get out of farmland.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's 1031 exchanges here in the US and other variations around the world are rather amazing. I mean, imagine that. I'm making this up. You buy something for $1 million, it's now worth 30 million. That's going to be a huge, even capital gains tax bill, but you're able to, quote unquote, within the guidelines that you noted, purchase another much more expensive property and keep that going. And to get liquidity, you're able to likely finance or refinance. So, and I don't want to get deeply into it. It's going to get me in nothing but trouble. But I'm assuming relatively what came out in the New York Times was probably pretty accurate about the president. And that's common among highly successful people in real estate, learning how to leverage depreciation, how to take certain losses, and for sure, that aspect of 1031 exchanges. Where that falls apart is if people are either personally guaranteeing or highly levered because they needed liquidity at some point, and then something happens, maybe COVID-19, where things go down in value, that could be a problem. So that is not without its risk as well, which actually leads me to my next question for you, Jay. What has been the impact of COVID-19 as we think of real estate as being heavily impacted, often negatively, but that's going to be more commercial and retail. The land itself, let's forget more owning the farm. How has the land been impacted by COVID-19, farmland specifically?
Yeah, we have not seen a large change in land value appreciation one way or the other this year with COVID-19. We think the biggest external factor actually that's been holding land value appreciation back over the last few years has been the Chinese trade war, right? More so than COVID-19. And so with whatever happens today in the election, we're hopeful that whatever administration or set of folks are in there will see a resolution, as well as China actually stepping up to what was agreed to last January. In terms of stepping up their purchases of agricultural products from the U.S. to about $40 billion. They previously were at $25 billion, and that dropped all the way down to a little short of $10 billion during the height of the trade war. But they're showing signs that they, might actually implement that fully. And I think that will be the biggest sort of external driver to land values here in the short term, or the next year or two, versus anything related to the coronavirus.
So that's additional revenue, significant amounts of money, because there's a tremendous amount of Chinese people relative to the US farmer. And I'm assuming from the China perspective, it's of higher quality and lower cost than other means of either producing themselves. I don't know much about the soil and farm opportunities in China, or other countries that may be quasi-competitive with us on farming.
Yeah, certainly Brazil and Argentina are very competitive on the soybean market, and that's our main competitor there. And they shifted a lot of their purchasing down there during when the trade war was hot. But yeah, Angelo, you're right that China has 2 problems with just producing all this stuff themselves. One is a social thing, and one is a structural thing, I guess. The structural thing is they just don't have enough water to do it in terms of natural rainfall. And they've chosen to utilize their water for power production in different ways as well. So when China's importing soybeans from Brazil and from the US, they're also basically importing water, right? The second area is more of a social side of things, which is people, I think, forget that they think of, since China has so many big cities, right, and it's industrialized and all this has happened, that there actually are like 600 million people, which is a lot of people, that are out, farming, 1 to 2 acres in China, as their livelihood and everything that they've done. And so trying to consolidate what is extremely inefficient agricultural production on small plots of land that are done by many, many people is a problem that even the Chinese government hasn't figured out a social engineering solution to. Yeah.
Interesting. I didn't think about that. I could certainly understand how that's true. When I'm thinking of threats in terms of risk, where my investment could go down, but that's kind of what insurance is for certain insects and bad weather. You have potentially hedging through the commodities market. You spoke a little bit about the China relationship on certain row crops, and that could be a value. So there are risks in any investment. What are some other things that maybe the average, even astute investor, doesn't think deeply enough about when it comes to investing in farmland or farms?
Yeah. So, I mean, the big macro risks, right, are a demand-based shock, right? So the Chinese trade war is a perfect example of that, right? U.S. agriculture has muddled through that primarily by, getting, combination of sticking it out as well as large direct payments, right, from the government to make sure that wasn't too painful. So you can think of external demand shocks as being a risk that's out there. The second one would be a macro environment in which we had higher interest rates, significantly higher interest rates without any inflation. So that's a very bad scenario for, I guess, a lot of real assets, including farmland, obviously, right? So, right now, the spread between the 10-year U.S. Treasury and our cash on cash yields after all fees and expenses is about 300 basis points, right, in terms of us being higher. But if the 10-year Treasury was, at 5% rather than 85 or 86 basis points of what it's at today, you can have some very different, impacts in terms of the asset class, right? On the micro side, like on the farm you own, yourself, right? The biggest risk there is not, some of this, do you have crop insurance or not? Did you hedge, the Chicago Board of Trade prices right or not? Did the operator you hired, and leased to, didn't pay you, that sort of thing. Those things are risks, but they're temporary things that you can course correct on and don't, torpedo your investment, right? The biggest risk on the micro side in terms of when you're owning farmland is did you, was your entry price correct, right? In terms of what you bought it at, right? Did you get a discount to market? Did you, not buy, at a short-term peak in prices, that sort of thing, like we saw in 2012, 2013. And then secondly, that farm that you bought, is there some flaw in it that is either really expensive to fix, right? Whether that's, drainage tile that you hadn't anticipated or something like that. Or does it have a fatal flaw that you can't fix, right? You bought a farm, behind a levee on the Mississippi River, right? And those are things you can't fix, right? Or you bought a farm on a smaller river that, floods half the farm every year, right? And there's no way to control it, right? Those are the risks that you have in a single farm investment or the actual investment.
And how has it been an opportunity and potentially good, or has it been more neutral? And it is a complex issue because technically it's federally illegal, although I guess hemp would not be, but cannabis. Has that been potentially a little bit of, well, that's an additional crop that's good for the farmer? How has that played out so far? If it's made any impact at all, maybe it's just too small.
Yeah, I mean, it's really its own thing because cannabis is produced in greenhouses, whether they're inside or outside, basically. So you don't need a tremendous amount of land in order to, grow a decent amount of cannabis. So Where I live in Washington, yeah, I think we were the first state to legalize at the state level. We saw different, production facilities pop up near some of our farms, but they were always near a town, and they were taking up, 5 or 10 acres. They aren't growing cannabis on a 1,000-acre farm or something like that. And I think and that's the main driver of that is if you can control the environment that it's growing in, you can get huge amounts of production, right, with cannabis versus, planting it outside and seeing what happens, right?
For sure. I mean, there's different inventions and innovations in farming. We mentioned some of them with aquaponics and all that. But I go back to what I always heard about real estate is they're not, making any more of it. A beachfront home is still incredibly valuable unless climate change gets real bad and it disappears. But I would think that owning high quality, like you said, that part of the US is the highest quality in the world. That's not going to change in the next year, 10, or perhaps even 100 years. We might even have better advancements to maintain the soil for other types of water production. I have no idea. But this goes back to the value of land as an investment. And I think it's very intriguing. Of course, this goes right up your alley and some of your thesis to what you do, but would love to hear your opinion.
Yeah, I mean, our view is that farmland is a highly stable, right, non-correlated real asset, right, that also has a unique feature that it has a coupon payment to it on a yearly basis. These farms have been farmed for 150 years. They're going to be farmed for another 150 years. The coupon payment is just as reliable as a U.S. Treasury, right? And so our clients, I guess maybe 3 investment theses, maybe they're all intertwined. Maybe some folks only believe in one, but one of them is that one that I just talked about in terms of the nature of the real returns that you receive. The second one obviously is the inflation hedge, right? So, land in agricultural productive land in general is an interesting inflation hedge. In particular, we feel row crops are more exposed than other aspects of agricultural land because, things like soybeans, and corn, I mean, they don't just go into food production, right? I mean, the compostable trash bags, under your sink are basically made out of corn, right? The ink in the pen that you're writing with, or if you're taking notes or whatever, a lot of that's soy-based, right? And so those row crops go into thousands and thousands of consumer products, right? And so it has broad-based inflation exposure. And then lastly is the point that you were making, Angelo, about they don't make it anymore, that sort of thing, which is, the projections is, to feed the world, that we need to double agricultural production, worldwide over the next, 40 years, just like we have done over the last 40 years. And that's not going to be done by, cutting down, the entire Brazilian rainforest. So, it's going to have to come from, innovation and increasing production, using less inputs like we have over the last 40 years into the next 40 years to even keep, sort of food prices and commodity prices where they're at right now.
Yeah, I mean, the legendary Jim Rickards, we had Jim speak at Family Office Association years ago. Look him up if you don't know who he is. Currency Wars and other amazing books. And he speaks about for families of great wealth would always benefit from owning gold, art, and land. And that land gets extra valuable when potentially it's farmland and agriculture. And I won't bore the audience with the detail, but even if unfortunately it's taken from you from a governmental perspective, it may take decades, maybe longer, but you might be able to go back and get that back as an asset. And we've seen that happen in certain parts of the world as regimes change. I'll ask you kind of one final question, then we'll segue a little bit, although you covered it just now to some extent, the great work that you're doing and how families can become more active as investors. I know I'm going to sound like Mr. Libertarian here, but are governments starting, owning, buying farms? And my concern with that would be you control food, you have a hell of a lot of power. I would feel a hell of a lot more comfortable if that's owned privately. That's just me. And that I know that came out of left field. You're like, Angelo, where did that question come from? But does our government own farmland?
Yeah. So the U.S. government doesn't own, actively producing farmland that's out there right now. They obviously own vast swaths of land, federally owned land, state of Nevada, whatever. It's like
Sure.
80% plus or whatever owned by the federal government. But the U.S. government doesn't. I would say, the Chinese government has been making a lot of investments in infrastructure that sort of control whether land in certain places, including Brazil, can actually get their products to the market. So their strategy has been, we don't want to go buy land as the Chinese government, in Africa or whatever. But if we own all the infrastructure to get, the plantains or the corn or whatever it is, from, Kenya, Brazil, whatever, to the world market, right? Then we, effectively have some control over, food supplies in other countries, as well as being able to bring that to China if we want to, right? More broadly, just for families in terms of owning farmland, I would not recommend, you should be a citizen of the country in which you own farmland or someone in your family should be, all right? I mean, I think it's just generally speaking, a bad idea to own a highly illiquid asset in a country that you're not a citizen that produces, food that the population might need to survive.
The government will take that from you if they need to.
Yeah, exactly. And if it ever comes down to it, you're not going to own it, right? If everything gets that serious. So, that would be my recommendation. There are, even in, Canada, US, both, there are some restrictions at the state level in different states, both Canadian provinces as well as US states, that do prevent foreign ownership of farmland.
And Jay, talk a little bit about your organization, Farm Opportunity. You mentioned that there's very few of them. You mentioned most of it is fund format where you're an LP, and that could have some advantages for some, but potentially for a more significant investor, separately managed accounts. Talk about what you do.
Yeah, so we have a company called Farmland Opportunity that makes direct investments for families and individuals in U.S. row crop farmland. We've been doing it outside of our family for a little over a decade, as Angelo kind of mentioned at the beginning. And so what we do is we have a separately managed account. We work with the family in terms of, if they have any specific preferences, like we talked about, whether organic or non-GMO or what have you, or whether they want to sort of let us design the portfolio for them. And then over a period of, we've had some clients that have been with us all 10 years that we've been doing it. More typically, it's an investment period over 2 or 3 years. We'll go out and build a set of farms. That would typically be 6 to 7 farms. Our average transaction is $1.4 million. Average account sizes there between 9 and 10 million. We do have a number of folks that are at 3 million to 5 million where they own 3 farms or 4 farms. We'll build that portfolio. We take care of all aspects of managing it in terms of hiring, the operator, all the reporting, everything with the USDA and that sort of thing. We have, we have an internal management company, the people that work for me that do that work out in those 10 states that I talked about. And so we've been doing this, as I mentioned, a little over 10 years. We have 42 families. All of them come from really personal referral talks, small talks like this. We don't even, we don't have a website, right? We don't really talk publicly much about what we're doing at all. And we think that gives us an incredible advantage in the transaction market where we're seen actually as a local buyer. Or it's, almost as Jay and his family, are buying a farm rather than some, person that, lives in New York and has never been to Iowa or some institution like TIA, CREF or Hancock or something like that. And so it has allowed us to develop, what we call our proprietary deal pipeline, where we're typically buying, around 25 farms a year, about one every 2 weeks. And so that rolls up to, roughly $35 to $40 million of farmland a year.
Absolutely. And yes, by the way, I have been to Iowa. when my son was younger, driving to Yellowstone Park in Wyoming. We had a couple of days in Iowa. And of course, being baseball fans, where did we go, Jay? Of course, the Field of Dreams.
Yeah. Yeah, that's where you find everyone from out of state in Iowa.
Yeah,
that's the only tourist attraction.
That's how you can pretty much tell the out-of-staters. That is probably very much true. So it's been really great interviewing Jay Girotto. And by the way, that's spelled Girotto, founder and CEO of Farm Opportunity. You mentioned, Jay, that you don't even have a website. I don't know if you're somewhat active on social media or if you mind giving out your email, but I think some people may be interested.
Yeah, you can certainly find me on LinkedIn. There's information out there about Farmland Opportunity. But yeah, my email is just the letter J, GIROTTO at farmop.com, which is FARM, O as in otter, P as in Paul, P as in Paul.com.
That's very easy. Thank you so much, Jay. In my conclusion, because there was some element of a discussion on investing, just a reminder, everyone, this is strictly for educational and entertainment purposes. It's early November of 2020. And the challenge sometimes with videos and podcasts is they're evergreen. They may be seen a month, a year, 20 years from now, and things or tax laws could be completely different. You have your own situation for liquidity and risk tolerance. There certainly are challenges in real estate, specifically land. So very simply in my opinion, a qualified purchaser plus. Our discussions are more focused on family office level families, and do your own diligence before you make any decision. This has been really exciting. I've become even much more of an advocate, not just because of what Jim Rickard says, although I think that is very intriguing. And listening to Jay made me even more of an advocate of families of great wealth, owning land, being active in private agriculture. I think that's very, very important. And I think there's multiple benefits besides tax and potentially return. And we left some things off the table because of time concerns, but I would highly recommend from a wealth preservation perspective and other community and social impact and good that families absolutely consider both farmland and farms. We'll certainly do more on this in the future, and this will weave its way into the private and consulting work that I do for families as well. On that note, I'm Angelo Robles. I'm the host of the Angelo Robles Podcast. I'm the founder and CEO at Family Office Association, a global membership organization dedicated to families of wealth and their family offices. We do a significant amount of original proprietary content, host near daily digital programming, and privately consult the families, often on creating or reinventing their family office. I'm very active on social media. Subscribe to our YouTube. It's simply as Family Office. I'm also, like Jay, active on LinkedIn and Instagram as well. Our website is familyofficeassociation.com, and my email is angelo@familyofficeassociation.com. We did have a couple of additional questions that came in. I'm sorry that I was not able to get to them. Jay did give his email. Feel free to email Jay those questions, or if you didn't get it, email me and I'll forward it to him. They were great questions, but due to time constraints, we were a little bit more limited today. Jay, thank you so much. I really enjoyed it and great to reconnect.
Yeah. Thanks a lot, Angelo.
Thank you. Bye-bye.